As an anthropologist, I have devoted a number of years to trying to make some sense of the bewildering diversity of relations that humans establish with non-humans, and particularly with all kinds of animals. And I've become quite convinced all the time that these relations are structured by ontological choices. The word choice is not the best, but there are very few accessible to designate what I have in mind. By ontological choices, then, rather than by reason or utility, or even by the specific features that specific animals afford to human perception and experience. I will give a brief example just to show what I mean by this general statement. Although domesticated animals share certain behavioral traits which have favored their effective domestication, there is absolutely no automaticity in the process. And many civilizations around the world have not deemed necessary to domesticate, less for lack of domesticable species than by reluctance towards the cross-relation of protection and submission that domestication implies. This is very clear in the lowlands of South America and in the north of North America, among native populations, of course. In the first case, Amerindians have tamed a number of species. In fact, all the species that could be tamed, that is most species available, from tapir to marmoset, passing by ocelots, peccaries, trumpeters, etc., without ever trying to have them reproduce in captivity. The mammals are the young of the animals that are hunted, that are killed during the hunt, while the birds are dislodged from the nests. And both the birds and the mammals are thus orphans that are hosted by those who killed their parents and raised by the women, either breastfeed or mouthfeed, according to whether they are birds or mammals, until they can fend for themselves. They are very, very rarely mistreated and never killed on deliberate purpose. So taming thus practiced is not a form of proto-domestication. Since it deals with each animal individually subtracted from its original environment, and it never transforms into the collective treatment of a community of reproduction. In the north, in subarctic America, the Amerindians, the natives, never have tried either to domesticate the reindeer, which is locally called the caribou. They hunted without restriction, while the people of Siberia, for their part, have domesticated the reindeer and also hunt their wild conspecifics. So even when it's technically possible, animal domestication is never ineluctable. These two examples illustrate a more general fact. Everywhere, human communities form with animal communities, hybrid collectives, the characteristics of which are highly variable according to the nature of the species with whom these collectives consort, according also to the type of control that is exerted on these species. This is, of course, obvious in the case of herders, especially nomadic herders, for whom livestock is an intrinsic component of society. But it is also quite obvious everywhere else, whether the animals are hunted and tamed, tamed without being hunted, hunted without being tamed, raised and not hunted, hunted and raised, neither hunted nor raised, used for their meat, for their secondary products, for the energy that they provide, as substitute of humans in the exchange or in sacrifices, as sources of symbols, models of classification, or for whatever other function. Each of these formulae specifies a particular mode of cohabitation and interaction between humans and particularized animal species, which render illusory any universal definition of what would be a relation between man and animals. Furthermore, these hybrid collectives of humans and animals do not form by chance, according to circumstances and to the whims of technical innovations. They are the direct product of the negative or positive qualities that humans have learned to detect in such or such a species according to the milieu where these humans have been socialized. Every human is capable to detect in certain animals, provided she comes close enough, certain traits of behavior that she will be able to interpret by comparing these traits with her own dispositions. And of course it's true that it is only the case, or possible, with in cases of relative phylogenetic proximity. It is far more easy to identify oneself with a bear than with an oyster. But beyond this common aptitude of humankind, which allows the sensitive and intentional beings that we are to recognize in forms of life that are not too distant from our signs of sensory experience, vary entirely according to the cultural context into which we are immersed. And indeed it is the type of quality that we believe we detect in an animal species that will define the relation that we will entertain with these species. If I perceive the animal which crosses my path as a reincarnation of my grandmother, or as a vehicle of an evil spell, or as a walking piece of meat, I will not treat it in the same way. Though there are no animal in itself. It's an absurd concept, especially as we are also animals. There are only animals of a bewildering diversity, with which humans, themselves very diverse, have established in the course of time very diverse links according to what they perceived in them. Besides the studies on folk classification that have been undertaken by anthropologists, specialists in ethnozoology, have shown that most non-European cultures, it's not exhaustive of course, but I would be prepared to say that all non-European cultures lack a word for animal. as they like the word for plant also. That is, as a taxon that would encompass a great number of forms of life. No doubt that the similarities between certain animal species have been perceived everywhere. But the necessity did not arise everywhere for a term that would synthesize certain of these similarities within, let's say, the scale of a kingdom that goes from the bacteria to the whale. A small exercise in comparative ornithology will allow us to understand the huge differences observable among humans in the representation that they construct of animals and of the treatments that derive from these constructions. If I have chosen birds for that, it's because they have in common to present certain behavioral and anatomical features that are very typical and that should offer, because of that, perhaps a universal foundation to the conception that humans have of birds, especially as they are probably the form of animal life that is the most easily observable anywhere else, in the world. Birds offer a series of very troubling similarities with humans, which makes of them excellent metaphors for social condition. First, it's the sexual dimorphism, which is very pronounced in certain species, and where the males and the females are can be distinguished as neatly by their plumage, as men and women in most cultures by the difference of their attire and ornaments. Second, there's an ontogenic genetic development, which is marked by stages that are very easy to identify. The egg, the recently hatched bird, the fledgling, the young subject, the adult, etc., which obviously evoke the different stages of life among humans. And finally, of course, the use of songs of a very great diversity, with, in certain species, very notable dialectical, you say, yes, dialectical, in the sense of dialects, not dialectics, differences within a single species, which are characteristics, of course, that could not fail to evoke human language. However, in spite of these common traits that are very easy to detect, the very diverse representations that humans have built of birds are based on distinctive features that I believe are more inferred than observed. And I'll begin with an Australian example. The Noongar tribes of the southwest of Australia were organized in moieties, two moieties, which were named after two birds. The white cockatoo, whose native name, Marnech, can be translated as the getter, and the raven, called Wardak, which is a term which signifies the watcher. The designation of an animal species by a general feature of its behavior, rather than by a term that is exclusive to this species, a taxon, is a very common feature in Australian societies. And it stems largely from the fact, or from the status given to, in this particular case, to these two totemic birds. They are the source and the substance the substantial embodiment of two contrasted sets of qualities, material and spiritual. Traits of character, conformation, bodily attitudes, mental disposition, etc. Qualities that are said to be specific to the human members of each of the moieties, at the same time as specific to all the non-human that are respectively affiliated to these two moieties. And this community of humors, temperaments, bodily dispositions within hybrid collectives had already been noted more than a century ago by two great pioneers of Australian ethnography, William Spencer and Frank Gillen, when they wrote apropos the Central Australia, a man regards the being that serves as his totem as being the same thing as himself. It is not, of course, the case that such an identification takes as an object a particular raven or a particular cockatoo observable in the environment, such as those that are shown here. But it is because these two species constitute emblems of a physical and moral relation of identity between certain entities of the world, relation which encompasses and cancels the apparent morphological and functional differences in order to better emphasize a common ground of ontological similarities. Let's move very far from Australia on the central high plateau of Mexico, where the Otomi Indians maintain also a relation of identification with birds, in particular with the black vulture, known in most Latin American countries as puru. These birds, who lives mainly and feeds mainly on garbage now, is indeed the most common avatar of the tona. The tona is an animal double whose life cycle is parallel to that of each human, since it is born and dies at the same time as a human, and everything which affects the physical integrity of one of the pair, the animal or the human, affect the other simultaneously. This belief was labeled under the word naturalism for a long time, and it's present in all Mesoamerica. And it was considered by the first anthropologists, the first historians of religion, people like Fraser, for instance, as a vivid proof of an incapacity shown by Mexicans in this case to distinguish between humans and animals, an incapacity that would be analogous to the kind of incapacity that Australian Aborigines would show when they were incapable of distinguishing between the totem and themselves. But it should be obvious that the shared destiny between the human person and his or her animal double, posited by the Otomi and by many other people in Mesoamerica and Central America, is far different from the material and spiritual continuity posited by the Noongar of Australia. First, because the animal here is an individuality in the case of Mexico, and not a prototypical species which is repository of shared properties, but also because a human does not possess the idiosyncratic traits or features of his or her animal replica, the one to which he or she is coupled. There is no physical or behavioral resemblance, the more so as the human ignores in general to what species his or her animal double pertains. It is on the contrary necessary that the human and his alter ego, his animal alter ego, be distinguished and clearly distinguished in essence and in substance for a relation of analogical correspondence to exist between them, and for the accidents that befall first one element of the pair to affect the other element, as if by reverberation. Let's move to another part of the world. Far away to the south of Mexico, in the upper Amazon, people with whom I've spent some years, the Achuar, which is a Chihuahuan tribe, a migrant, and eminent position to yet another bird, the toucan. It's, first of all, the most common of game animals, so it's the most common of food. And like other animals, other birds, and most mammals, the toucan is said to possess a soul that is similar to that of humans, a faculty, a feature which ranks the toucan among the persons endowed with subjectivity, with intentionality, which it can use to communicate with all sorts of entities endowed with the same privilege. And it is also because of this internal disposition that the toucan reputedly abide by the principles and the values that rule the social existence of the Achuar. In particular, the toucan is the exemplary embodiment among non-humans of the figure of the brother-in-law, which is a term by which it is very often referred or called in certain contexts, which makes of him the typical partner of the relation of affinity that men maintain with game animals. However, the humanity shared by the Achuar and by the toucans is of a moral nature. It's not a physical humanity that they share. Their identical interiorities, the foundation of what is common between them, is lodged in bodies with very different qualities and very different ways of behaving and acting in the world. Bodies which define and render manifest the frontiers of very clearly defined social units, let's say tribe species, and where these respective lives unfold. So by contrast with the vulture of the automy, which is an anonymous singularity, which remains foreign to the person to which it is coupled by an identical destiny, the toucan of the Achuar is a member of a community of the same nature as that of humans, and as such, the potential subject of a social relation with any other entity, human or non-human, which is placed in the same situation of being a subject with the possibility to act in the world. But the toucan also differs from the totemic birds in Australia, in that there exists no material continuity between humans and the bird, and in that also it reputedly models its behavior and its institution on those of humans and not the reverse. Let's get back now to Europe and consider the qualities that we grant to the parrot, which is undoubtedly an exotic bird, but one whose troubling capacity to mimic human voice has provided, since a long time ago, occasions of diversion and a pretext for philosophical distinctions. Great philosophers, Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, and a few others, have emphasized that the sentences uttered by the parrot in no way provide an index of its humanity, since this bird cannot adapt the impressions that it receives from the external objects to the signs that it reproduces by imitation, reason why it is incapable of inventing new languages. Let me remind you that in Cartesian ontology, animals are, of course, purely material beings, because they cannot a priori participate to this non-extended substance that is the soul. And although this position has been often criticized ever since, we tend nevertheless to hold to it spontaneously when we admit that humans are distinguished from non-humans by reflexive consciousness, by subjectivity, by the power to signify, by the mastery of symbols, and by language, through which all these faculties are expressed. We do not, when I mean we naturalists, normal naturalists, we do not doubt either the implicit consequence of this postulate, namely that the contingency inherent to the capacity to produce arbitrary signs as their humans, to differentiate between themselves by the form that they give to their conventions, and this as a result of a collective disposition that we used to call in French le génie d'un peuple, in German Volksgeist, and that we now more commonly call culture. Finally, much as Descartes, but with the more solid foundation that Darwinism wrote us, we do not hesitate to acknowledge that the physical continent of our humanity locates us in a material continuum within which we do not appear as a singularity that would be widely different from any other organized entity in the world. In short, the accepted ontological premises in the West for a few centuries is that we differ from animals by the mind, not by the body. These four examples illustrate very dissimilar manners to infer qualities in animals and to conceive as a consequence the relations that these qualities authorize. In the Australian case, these animals are taken as emblems of qualities that are relatively abstract, that humans and non-humans share, and which establish their common identity beyond the apparent difference of morphology, of form, of appearance. In the Mexican case, animals serve to posit an anonymous relation of correspondence between a human individual and an animal individual that share a common destiny. In the Amazonian case, animals are treated as subjects with whom one can establish relations of person to person. Finally, in the modern Western tradition, animals are rather perceived as animated things that present with humans some physical similarities. Is there a way to detect a general pattern in the diversity of ways according to which humans relate to animals and endow such or such a species with particular properties? An option which I've been following of late consists in examining how humans figure animals and thus perceive their qualities and salient features so as to render them visible in images. Now, the manners of perceiving contrast and similarities between human and non-human animals are not infinite. In fact, the number of possible formulae is rather restricted, and they correspond to the 4 cases we have just briefly reviewed in relation to birds. Either humans say they are alone in possessing a mind, an interiority, a soul, at the same time that they admit that they are linked to the continuum of non-humans by their physical characteristics. And this is the conception that became dominant in Europe a few centuries ago and which I've decided to call naturalism. Or we accept the reverse formula of naturalism. This is the case among the native populations of Amazonia, among northern North America, in Siberia, and other parts of the world, by saying that the majority of existing beings have an interiority which is similar to our own, but they distinguish themselves from us by their body. Beasts are beasts no more, since they have a soul, but their body, each with its biological tool, its particular biological tools, give access to worlds that are differentiated because they are plugged by their physical dimension to aspects of the world that are different for each species. And the term species here is not to be taken in a naturalist sense. It's a class of things that have a different form. There remain, and this is, I've chosen to revive, as was said, an old word, animism, to define this dimension. There remain 2 other formulae. In certain, humans and non-humans share within a named class the same physical and moral properties that are issued from a prototype, and they distinguish themselves as a set from other classes of the same time, and this is totemism as we find it among Australian Aborigines. And in the last formula, all the elements of the world, all the objects, the body, the quality, the states, appear different from one another, reason why it is imperative to find means to organize these riot of singularities, to pair them, to define between them stable links. And since it is analogical reasoning which allows the establishment of these correspondences, I've chosen to call that analogism, which is a way to perceive the world, which is very common in the world, that was dominant in Europe until the Renaissance, and which characterizes very different civilizations, both in the Far East, but also in Western Africa, the Andes, or as we have seen in the example of the Urubu in Mexico. Each of these ways to detect resemblances and differences between humans and non-humans entails, of course, very different conceptions of what is an animal and of the relations that can be maintained with animals. And this is what we are going to see with a few images that figure these different conceptions and visions of animals. Let's start with what I've called animism. In animist cultures, or animic cultures, animals have a spirit, and many animals are themselves a spirit, that we call a spirit, traditionally. In the West, that may be benevolent or malevolent, but that cannot be dispelled easily. So, to figure animals implies to render visible their interiority, the fact that they are spirits, precisely, and show that this common interiority that all animals and humans, of course, possess are lodged in bodies with very different physical dispositions and very different physical forms, which can be, which should be identified easily by clues that indicate what kind of body it is and what kind of species, what kind of tribe, what kind of collective they form. This is why in animic regimes one encounters so often composite images where are conjoined anthropomorphic elements which evoke human intentionality and attributes that are specific to animals, to spirits, to plants, etc. So the most common images, or they are the most coherent cognitively, are those that include tenuous clues of humanities, for instance, elements of a face, grafted upon forms that are globally stereomorphic. However, such images are not chimeras, they are not composites, in fact, they are only composite in appearance. They do not figure chimerae. That would be composed of different anatomical pieces borrowed from different species. They figure non-humans of which it is indicated, thanks to a few human predicates, that they possessed, like humans, an interiority that render them capable of the social and cultural life. I'll show you a few examples. It's the U-Peak masks from the U-Peak of Alaska figure that very realistically because they take the very simple device of inserting a human face, what looks like a human face, but is the interiority of the animal. That is, it is the soul, as you said, it's Yua in U-Peak, which means that it is the element by which the animal possesses the same features, the same characteristics that humans, intentionality, subjectivity, a soul, a mind, whatever. So you have here different forms of inserting this interiority into representations of animals. This one is very economical in terms of plastically, because it's a face, but it's the very tenuous evocation of a human face with the two slits as evocation of human eyes. And in some cases where it's more difficult, when I said it's easier to identify with a bear than with an oyster, in the case of clams, the U-Peak took they added limbs in order to emphasize the humanity of the neo-humanity of the clams. Metamorphosis plays a central part in animic cultures, because it is not so much a change of form as a change of perspective. That it's a change of perspective under which you perceive something, which allows then to perceive a being on either from the point of view of its interiority, something which renders him similar to humans, or from the point of view of its body, whether human or animal. So, in a way, metamorphosis, which is so common in animic cultures, should be qualified as a sort of anamorphosis. It's a change of point of view, but there is at one moment there's a small commuting moment that will allow one to change the way the other being is perceived. There are many ways to present that. One of the easiest ways is, of course, the transformation mask of the Northwest Coast. It's not the human which is inside the mask of this eagle. It's the human-like subjectivity of the eagle. Here is another case among the Lupics, but this is a bad spirit. So you see these teeth, and it's predatory grin. Another way to do it is by lateral division. And so metamorphosis is not only a metamorphosis between humans and animals, or animals and humans, it operates with any form of life. Here it's a metamorphosis between walrus and caribou. And one part of the face, when you see it, is the walrus, and the other part of the face is the caribou. But there's always an element that is a little bit bizarre in the metamorphosis. So here, on the side of the caribou, you still have the teeth of the walrus. That shows that it's not what it looks like. So that's an interesting way to operate this change of perspective, no? Lateral. This one is an interesting case also because it comes from a very different part of the world. It comes from a native population of Malaysia, the Mar-Betisek. And it's the mask of a shaman, of a tiger. And it's got, on one side it's a human, on the other side it's a tiger. And when you see the mask, I curated an exhibition at the Musée du Quai Branly 2 years ago, where I exhibited this mask, and you only have to walk 2 paces, and you will flip to the point of view of the tiger, or flip to the point of view of the human. So this is metamorphosis precisely, a very economical way to present the metamorphosis. It's been now very much used in contemporary Inuit sculpture, which is very much in demand now in the international ethnic art market. This is one case. This is another case. It's a woman shaman, but it's most at the same time. Also, you can transform human bodies into animal bodies, or you can transform human bodies into animal images, which is the Amazonian formula. You can do that, for instance, by borrowing to animals certain of the dispositions. And how do you borrow a disposition from an animal? You borrow part of its body. So this is what some of these headdresses do. Of course, they're the same function as headdresses as well. I mean, they mark differences, social differences, although they are not very marked in Amazonia. But at the same time, you have to figure that the mythology in general, but specifically in Amazonia, is not, as is usually thought, the passage from nature to culture. It's rather a sort of natural history, in the sense that every myth relates how a collective of beings that were both natural and cultural, without specific forms, or rather with polyvalent bodies that were neither human nor animals, transformed into specific species, and retained at the same time the cultural potentiality that they had at the time of so-called the state of nature. So they cooked, and animals had an interiority, and they retained their interiority, etc., etc. So what you do when you want to retain something that you have lost in this process of speciation, as a human, you have lost this polyvalent body, and the animals have received part of this polyvalent body, but every animal has lost also. So you borrow from other animal species part of these dispositions, and the easiest way to do that is with headdresses, because these headdresses are composed of feathers from at least 20 different species of birds. So you expand your own potentialities by drawing from animal bodies. This is another case. There's more than 20 different species here. Another way to do that is to use the paintings that animals use to paint themselves. You have to recall, or perhaps not recall because you don't know it. In Amazonia, animals see themselves as humans. So, how do they distinguish themselves between different species, let's say? They are humans with different bodily ornaments. So they know that they are a jaguar, and this is a tapir, and this is etc., etc. So these ornaments, what are they? Well, they are body paintings in particular. So if, as a human, you want to be associated or taken for a specific species, what will you do? You'll use the painting, the body painting, that the specific species uses. So this shaman who wants to pass for a jaguar in the community of jaguar wants to use, so let's call it an ontological camouflage in order to become part of the community of jaguar for a variety of reasons I don't have the time to explain. What will he do? Well, he'll use the same paintings that the jaguar used in order to distinguish themselves from other animal species. Let's turn now to something which appears more familiar to us, but which should not appear familiar after what we've seen. That's naturalism. As I said, the formula of naturalism, it's the reverse of the one that we learned at school, or it's the reverse of the one that we have just seen, and it's the one that we learned at school, which permeates us ever since childhood, which is, it's not by their body, but by their mind that humans are differentiated from non-humans. And, of course, the two features that the naturalist figuration must render visible, by contrast with what we have seen before, are the distinctive interiority of humans, on the one hand, and the physical continuity of beings and things in an homogeneous space. Two objectives which began to be implemented in a new way of painting, which arose in Burgundy and in Flanders in the 15th century, and which was characterized by the irruption of the figuration of the individual, first in illuminated manuscripts, where humans with realistic features, were depicted in a realistic setting, doing realistic tasks, than in paintings that were characterized by the continuity of the spaces represented by the precision with which all the details of the material world were rendered, and by the individuation of human subjects which were endowed, each of them, with a proper physiognomy. So the revolution in the art of painting which occurs at that time in the 15th century establishes durably in Europe a manner to figure which results in an ever-increasing virtuosity in two genres of representation. The painting of the soul, it is the representation of the interiority of humans as an index of the singularity of human persons, and the imitation of nature, that is to say, the representation of the material contiguities within the physical world that deserves to be observed and described for itself. In the description of this physical world, animals play a very important part. By contrast with the Middle Ages, where animals were figured mainly as symbols, either in sacred images or in the primitive form of heraldry, and where the exactitude of the likeliness of the figuration was less important than their situation in the scene that is described or depicted, and in the specific features that were presented. In naturalist figuration, what is foremost is the precision in the description of the appearance and in the behavior. And this is notable already in the 14th century, in these little illuminations decorating the margins of the manuscripts, precisely called marginalia. And you'll see immediately the contrast between two ways of figuring, let's say, a jaguar, no? So this one should appear bizarre now, by reference to the preceding one. I hope at least. The animals being bodies without mind, it is their body which is depicted with a manic attention to exactitude, even when this exactitude is partly imaginary, for instance in the famous case of the Dürer and his rhinoceros, an animal which he probably saw, and for which he had only sketches and second-hand descriptions. Animal painters, specializing in the depiction of animals, such as Peter Böll, used to work on the motive, and they were trying to capture the ideal type of the species as a sort of paragon of the form and the behavior of the species. Peter Böll painted many exotic birds in the menagerie in Versailles, and these images that may appear trite in spite of the quality of the execution, there are several of them, here from Australia also, in fact became bizarre also when one compares them with animic images that we have just seen. For an Amazonian Indian, an Ara, like this bird here, is a being that sees itself as a human and who thus wears a particular kind of ornament so as to distinguish himself from other species who see themselves also as humans. So that the image of an ara in Amazonia is the image of an ara as the ara sees itself. As Engel said that the ara sees itself. So, ornaments and paintings on the human body. And not as Böll represented here, as a colored projection into dimensions. There is as much convention in that representation as in the feather headdress that we have seen earlier. I see that time is running. Trying to accelerate a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about totemism now. Totemic identification is based on the sharing within a class of beings that conjoin humans and non-humans of a set of physical and moral qualities. In Australia, among Aboriginal societies, where this ontology is best exemplified, the core of qualities that characterize the totemic class is said to proceed from a primordial prototype, which is traditionally called in the ethnographic literature a being of the dream time, and which bears very often the name of an animal. Now it is by depicting this animal, but in a very particular way, that some Aborigines, not all, try to render visible the profound identity of humans and non-humans of the totemic class. It's an internal identity based on the fact that they incorporate a single body, a single essence, the source of which is localized in specific sites. And it's a physical identity, for they are made of the same substances, they are organized according to the same structure, and they possess as a consequence the same kind of temperament and disposition. This very original manner to depict a totemic animal is very well, or very clearly at least, illustrated by paintings so-called in the X-ray style, especially those of the Kunwishku in the western part of Arnhem Land in northern Australia. These are bark paintings that depict animal and human silhouettes, lifeless, within which are represented with a great precision skeletons and organs, so as to render obvious, as is the case here, the permanence of the identities of structure and substance between humans and non-humans by using the figurative language of physicality. What is more physical than that? In Kunwishku iconology, two features characterize all the representations of the being of the dream time under their animal form. First, they are perfectly lifeless, immobile, they are not moving. They are never figured accomplishing an action or in interaction with one another. You have some two spirits there, but they are sort of metaphors of the humans. But the important things here are the growl guides. It's a large bird. It's not that they are dead, since they are immortal. Besides, the white diagonal lines with which they are decorated, very clear here, shimmer and vibrate in the light, thus manifesting the power which still emanates from them. To depict them while moving would go against what they represent, which is the integral charter of totemic organization, that by which everything in the world is where it is, that is, in its appropriate place. Secondly, each being of the dream time is represented as a silhouette that is marked on a plain background. There's no external decoration, there's no evocation of the surroundings. What is figured here is not a particular entity located in the world. It's a condensate of certain qualities of the world that are wrapped in a particular being. So beyond this totemic prototype, there is nothing else. There is no context, there is no environment, there is no temporality. Except perhaps elsewhere, another being of the same kind, which contains other qualities of the world, which is figured under the aspects of an animal of another species. Let's end this world tour with a few words on analogism. As I said before, analogism is based on the idea that the world is peopled with elements, none of which is similar to the other, a world which would be very difficult to inhabit and to conceptualize because of the huge number of differences which compose it. If it were not for the possibility to find between beings, as between the parts of which they are made, networks of correspondence that allow an interpretive path. This is why the figurative objective of analogism is first and above all to render present, visible, the links of analogy between discontinuous elements, which implies to multiply the components of the image in order to better de-individualize its subject or its topic. In that sense, whatever the exactitude of the representation of the details that an analogist figuration can attain, it doesn't aim to imitate with likelihood a natural prototype that would be objectively given, but to restore the chain of affinities within which this prototype acquires a meaning and an agency. So, obviously, the classical figure of analogism, the figure which allows the best probability to identify an image as pertaining to this regime, is the chimera, an imaginary animal, a being composed of attributes that belong to different species, but which present a certain anatomical coherence. The chimera is an hybrid with constitutive elements that are borrowed from heterogeneous sources, but who are united in a sui generis being, which is rarely conceived as imagery, at least immediately, which is sometimes conceived or perceived as a singular animal or divinity, more often perceived as a member of a not very common species, although a very real one, like the unicorn. So here are two examples from very different parts of the world. We're going back to Mexico here with the Mexican feathered serpent, and here from our own tradition with the locusts in the apocalypse. For this aggregate of qualities to be plausible, it requires that each of them be recognizable in an anatomical piece. It requires also that the combination of these elements succeeds in giving the illusion of life under the form of an organism which appears capable of autonomous action. For the chimera always possess a unity of composition and a bodily schema, but they are more or less credible, in spite of the very dissimilar characters of the pieces of which the chimera is made. The wings of the dragon, of Garuda, of Pegasus, are always set on the back, not on the belly or on the ears. And the animal heads are usually set on human torsos or vice versa, as in these two examples, very telling examples. And it's not easy to do that for a shark, for instance, no? Which is a shark. The lion is much more. There is probably a cognitive constraint to this requirement of relative likelihood, at least if a real existence is ascribed to the product of the composition. The chimera thus possesses this remarkable property of bringing to light, of showing in a unique entity a set of very weak discontinuities that are systematically organized. That is to say, it embodies in an image, with the utmost economy of means, the double characteristic which defines analogism, which is the heterogeneity of elements on the one side and the coherence of their links on the other side. So we have just reviewed very different ways of figuring animals and thus of representing their qualities, which should prompt us, of course, to be cautious and not to generalize to the rest of the world, that is beyond the West, beyond Europe, attitudes, sensibilities, behavior towards animals, which result in Europe and in North America from a very specific historical path, and which present themselves furthermore in the West itself under a good variety of guises, according to the species, according to the degree of familiarity with these species, according also to the habits of the social milieu and those that are transmitted by local traditions. So to the question of what is a non-human animal, there is no answer. There is no simple answer, at least. Beyond that provided by that which provides very simple and obvious and empirical observation. It is the class of organisms within which I can find the most immediate support for an identification to a non-human alter, provided that certain aspects of its appearance and its behavior allow me to do that. But what I do afterwards, I, as a human, anywhere in the world, in any historical circumstances, is what I do with this potentiality of identification is very largely determined by the ontological choices that I learned to receive for true in the culture where I was raised. In short, there is at least as many genres of relation with animals that are genres of treatment of humans. So that it is incautious to convert the very specific relations with a few animal species that have developed in the course of a half-century among the urban elite of northern conventions into the only legitimate norms to regulate the relations between the whole assemblage of humans and the whole assemblage of animals. World of ocean, there are many examples daily that show us that we are peddling our own way to deal with animals to different parts of the world where these ways are not only unknown but utterly incomprehensible.